I'll take a mic because I don't have Natalie's. I could project, but I'll get sore really fast. And Natalie made it sound like a rock concert. I'll try to live up to that. I mean, I could headbang a little bit, but anyway, thank you. And yes, thanks to Kimberly. The lineup is awesome. And also thanks to the, technical masters. I don't see anybody back there, but I don't know if it's Alejandro or Carlos working today, but we often forget them, and they help these weeks run really smoothly. So give them a nod on your way out. So here's the topic, and don't worry if you don't know all these letters. Oh, they'll come up. This talk today isn't about definitions so much, so they'll come up, but I think a lot of people have a pretty good idea of what this all means. So hands off whose kids, you'll understand why I put that there shortly. How 2S LGBTIQA affirming curriculum saves lives, and don't worry, we'll be explaining what all these things mean, okay? I want to start with where we are. Jojage, also known as Muniang. You probably call it Montreal a lot of the time. We're actually on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka homelands. If you don't know what Kanien'kehá:ka means, a lot of you have heard of the Mohawk people. This is their name in their own language. They're the traditional custodians of this whole area and beyond, all right? Anishinaabe people, who you might have grown up hearing referred to as Algonquin, have a long-standing relationship, ongoing relationship to these lands as well. I'm not talking about ownership so much because those are colonial concepts, but that's a whole talk in of itself. And I like to do these acknowledgements in terms of gratitude. I'm grateful for their stewardship, them taking care of these lands for millennia, because it's thanks to that that a lot of us here who are not indigenous to this place are able to survive and thrive. And I don't believe in doing land acknowledgements without also talking about accountability. As somebody who's mostly a settler, mostly non-Indigenous, I do have some accountability in terms of, like I said, I get to survive here and thrive thanks to all these generations, millennia's worth of generations of people taking care of this land, being in reciprocity with the land, meaning they weren't just taking from the land, they were giving back to it. And when we say unceded, that's one of the first words up there. Colonizers, most of my ancestors, French and English, Scottish, came and just kind of took it. And, that's obviously more nuanced than that and more complicated than that, but it's still stolen land, essentially. It was never given up. So a lot of people are still suffering as a result. There's ongoing damage of colonization, and that affects our topic today in terms of sexuality and gender diversity, because before colonization, a lot of nations that existed here were a lot more welcoming of this kind of diversity than the colonizers were. So today, we saw, and we'll come up again, 2S, Two-Spirit, people in communities here who would have, people today would call maybe gay or lesbian or trans or related terms, were accepted in their cultures for the most part. And then with colonization, a lot of people became marginalized within their own communities. So it is very relevant to the talk today, even though the talk today is not specifically about Indigenous nations. There are some of the people who have suffered the most from this colonizer mentality that is very homophobic and transphobic. In terms of accountability as a settler, that means that when I talk about these topics, I can't forget to mention that, and that this work of trying to undo stereotypes needs to be in partnership with Two-Spirit people and kind of listening to their voices whenever possible, and informing ourselves. Anytime you have the opportunity to hear from Indigenous people about this or other topics, take it. YouTube videos, go to a talk. There are talks happening here on campus throughout the year. Take that opportunity. And if you need to, you want to buy a shirt, sometime you want to buy some art, encourage Indigenous artists. And I say this because I'm very proud to be wearing a shirt with a design on it. You can't read it from where you are probably. It says, "Respect is sacred," designed by Kanien'kehá:ka artist Cyrus Smoke, who's also one of your peers, by the way. So, you need a t-shirt. We all need to buy things. Try to encourage Indigenous businesses. That's one thing you can do, among many others. Why is the thing not working? Okay. The other thing about this place, and we'll come back to this, but this is just 2 years ago, right? And this is going to come up. There was a huge protest in Montreal. Well, protest and counter-protest, and different words you could use here. And across the country, you had these events, protests. This will come up, but I was at this one, right? So on one hand, you had some folks who called themselves the Hands Off Our Kids movement. That's why the title of the presentation is Hands Off Whose Kids? So they were saying, hands off our kids, parents know best, and we're going to get more into that if you're still wondering what am I talking about. And a lot of showed up to counter their protest, because what they're protesting basically is the inclusion of LGBT topics in schools. A lot of folks in these movements don't want their kids to hear about diversity when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity, And there are different reasons for that, and we're going to break that down. And some of us were saying, well, yeah, but your movement is actually harming us, and it's harming kids who are transgender, kids who are gay, kids who are bisexual, kids who are asexual, and so on and so forth, okay? So I was, somewhere in this crowd here. These are all, by the way, you're going to see a lot of pictures from some of these events, people with signs and stuff, and I always put the photo credits. So if you have actually accessed these slides, you can actually go see a lot of news articles that report on these things. So I'm going to share with you, I don't usually like slides with a bunch of text here, and we're not necessarily going to look at it all, and I do not encourage you to try to get all this down, but I was there, and I wanted to start, before I get into the subject matter, to kind of be very transparent about my stake in this, and my role in this, and where I'm coming from, not just as a professional. I'm going to be bringing some social science perspectives to this, some concepts we can use to try to understand what's going on. But heck yeah, I'm on sabbatical I'm very rusty, and wording is difficult because I'm very out of practice. My colleagues have been doing this for almost 2 months now, and I'm still on vacation mode, So, heck yeah, I am affected by this. Does this bias my talk? Well, some people would say so. But my biases are very much supported by social science work. So this is what I wrote on, yes, I'm old, I'm on Facebook. I know it's for old people, Gen Xers and up. I spent over 4 hours at a demo to protect all trans and queer people today. It was a counter-protest against people who falsely believe that queers, trans, and allies are somehow indoctrinating their kids, we're going to talk about that, to make them queer or trans. So apparently we're the big baddies trying to make all kids queer or trans or something. They claim to want to protect their kids from indoctrination, but they brought their young children there to teach them to hate us. How is teaching kids to be bullies protection? That's what I wanted to know. After 20-ish years of being out as queer and 16 years out as trans, I have seen many things said about us online. If you're queer or trans, some of you know this, you need nerves of steel before you go into comment sections of anything online, right? So we see this, a lot of people hiding behind the anonymity of the screen. But then to be there, to hear and see people really foaming at the mouth, all right? I was face-to-face with people who were foaming at the mouth, yelling, "Leave our kids alone." I walked around for 2 weeks after this with their voices in my head. Just imagine that. You were faced with a group of people who are trying to shove you back in a closet and who think you're too disgusting to be around their kids. It's just, I'm just thinking about it, I'm getting kind of nauseated, all right? So to hear and see people foaming at the mouth, clearly wanting us to not exist, was disturbing at a deeply visceral level. So I want to be transparent about that. This is my experience. This is the experience of a lot of folks who are there trying to protect the next generation of queer and trans people. This clicker is very slow. There we go. So just really quickly outline how we're going to go through this. I'm going to talk a little bit, that was the kind of tagline to the talk, right? How 2S LGBT2SIQA affirming / inclusive education saves lives. So just to kind of give you that longer term context of how, for the past couple of decades, how we've been working to make schools safer for everybody, all right? Then we'll look at the current context. What's some legislation that's happened in the past couple of years, and we'll look at this Hands Off Our Kids movement and what they're claiming. And then we'll kind of break things down and debunk some of the claims they're making that you might hear from sometimes people who say they have good intentions, that they don't hate anybody but, right? You all hear people say that sometimes. I'm not sexist / racist / homophobic / but, right? And then they're about to say the most fucked up thing you've ever heard come out of somebody's mouth. So we'll debunk some of those things so that next time you hear these things, you hopefully can be empowered to kind of talk back to it in a maybe more informed way. Because I remember what it's like to be 17, 18, and sometimes you're dealing with parents, friends, whoever, and you know they're wrong, but you don't have the arguments. And I remember how frustrating that is, right? And they sound super cool and logical about it, and you can't really argue back. Well, hopefully some of this stuff can help you do that if you are so inclined, and maybe time for closing thoughts. We'll see what we get through, right? Because a lot of folks I over-prepared, and I have more than I can probably reasonably get through. Quick content warning, there are some very brief mentions of violence and suicide, nothing super graphic or detailed, but just so that you know, we will be talking about a couple of stats about these things. So just be prepared for that if this is something that affects you. So this is our first section, how to, as LGBTIQA affirming / inclusive school saves lives. So just a quick, again, the presentation is not about defining all these terms. You've probably seen variations of this before, and we're not gonna go hardcore into all the definitions because that's not what really matters here, right? But we're talking about diversity in terms of sexual orientation, who are we attracted to? So you have for the classic LGB here, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and you know, there are heterosexuals too in the world, believe it or not. They exist and it's fine, they're valid. I'm being facetious here because I don't think I need to affirm that. Most people think. 2S, Two-Spirit, as I mentioned. So Two-Spirit is a term that was created by some indigenous activists back in the 90s to kind of encapsulate a whole bunch of terms that existed in a whole bunch of different indigenous languages here on this continent before colonization. Every culture, every language had its own term to refer to people who didn't fit the gender binary of man or woman. And it goes beyond sexual orientation, it goes beyond gender, so I encourage you to look that up and learn more about it. But like I mentioned before, they're often some of the most heavily impacted because as indigenous people, they deal with racism from mainstream society, like a lot of racialized people do, but then on top of that, they deal with homophobia, transphobia, things like that because of colonization, and sometimes from their own people who've absorbed some of these mentalities. We have trans, intersex. I'm not going to talk about intersex much specifically in this talk, but I encourage you to learn more about intersex realities, all right? Because these are folks who have surgeries when they're babies, sometimes to quote-unquote fix them because the doctors can't figure out what sex they are, and it's really messed up and they suffer all their lives. Queer, Q for queer, a lot of people appropriate that term to mean a wide range of these things. Asexual, another community that is often forgotten. Yes, there are some people who are asexual, and that's a whole spectrum in and of itself, which I encourage you to learn about if you don't already know much about it. So we're going to talk about what this means soon to us LGBTIQA affirming / inclusive education or schools, okay, and how this can save lives. So what do I mean by affirming / inclusive education? I'm going to be using the shorthand inclusive education for the rest of the talk so that I don't have to say this huge long phrase all the time. Like I said, I'm out of practice talking, so my vocal cords are hurt already. I'm not Natalie with the whatever caffeine pills you take in the morning, and you just keep talk and talk and talk. It's not an accusation, it's awesome. I wish I had your energy. So when we're talking, so there's two aspects, there's many more aspects to inclusive education than this, but we're gonna touch on two main ones today. One is the curriculum, right? The stuff you actually learn when you're in school, right? So from K to 12 and then in CEGEP and then later on in university, there's a curriculum. There's things that you're taught in terms of knowledge, factual stuff, theories, approaches in a certain field, especially in higher education, some basic stuff, and skills that you pick up, right? That's all part of the curriculum. So when we're talking about inclusive education, it includes curriculum. So you have the inclusion of subject-relevant material that portrays to us LGBTIQA people or realities in affirming ways, meaning not putting them down, all right? Reducing stereotypes. That's going to be a big part of our talk. So for example, kids, you know when you remember being in kindergarten, first grade and all that, and you read, hopefully you were some of are not reading so much anymore in schools, but you're probably reading books. You have picture books with just short stuff at first, right, when you're little kids, and they'll show families, right? So growing up in the 70s and 80s, back in the 1900s, a whole century ago, because yeah, I'm old, you know what you're supposed to say when your teacher says that, right? When your teacher says, I'm old, you're supposed to say, no, you're not old. You're young and cool like us. You've had me before. Some of you should remember that. I'll test you later, all right? So since I'm old, you learn fast, okay? So back then, like the only books we would see with families, you'd have mom, dad, and the kids, the nuclear family based on a heterosexual couple, and that was the only kind of family you would see. And here in North America, usually they were white. A lot of people got left out by this, right? So kids who, sometimes you know when you're very young that you don't fit that mold, but maybe you have two moms or two dads, or maybe you have one mom or one dad, or maybe you were adopted and you're in a foster home, or maybe you live in an extended family network that doesn't fit that mold. So that left out a lot of people, including people on the sexual and gender diversity spectrum, okay? So affirming curriculum can simply have stories of kids who have, for example, two moms or two dads, or who has a parent who transitioned, all right? So when I transitioned, my son was 8, I got him a book that was called My Mommy is a Boy, right? And it's just this very simple way of helping kids understand these things. And then they feel included in what counts as a family, right? Later on, you learn history. Well, within that history, you know, there's a history teacher here in the room, there's at least one. You know, if you're touching on anything that's happened in the past few decades, there's a whole bunch of resistance movements to oppressive legislation. Here in Canada, the fight for same-sex marriage is one example. The fight, some people felt it was important to have the option to have an X marker on their passports. Here in Quebec, there was a lot of fighting to remove some nasty criteria to be able to get your sex marker changed. So if you were in transition, you used to have to get sterilizing surgery to be able to get that new letter on your ID that said you were of a gender, you know, different than what you were born as. And people fought to have that changed. And that's part of history, right? Resistance movements, historians like to talk about such things, right? So these are just some examples. There are many, many more. So affirming curriculum, a lot of people think it's about indoctrination, as we'll see later. It's not. It's really just showing this exists. You know? The other part of it, the other thing that's come a long way in the past 20 years or so is that now the treatments of students and staff who are, for example, trans, again, that's just one example, respecting their self-identity. So teachers now in elementary schools, high schools, here, of course, are much more likely than they were 20 years ago to respect a person's chosen name and pronoun. So maybe some of you have had that experience where maybe your legal name isn't accurate, but it's the one that's on all your paperwork, on your class lists, and you've asked your teachers maybe by Mayo, say, can you call me this instead and use these pronouns? You have some teachers now asking you your pronouns, and you know that's you know, something that we've come a long way with, and that's part of affirming and inclusive education, all right? So these are two things we're going to touch upon because they're things that some people are trying to legislate, and we're going to look at those attempts, and some of these Hands Off Our Kids movement, they're protesting this stuff as well. By the way, if I say something that you're like, you don't understand and like you need a quick clarification, please go ahead and hopefully I'll see you. But if you don't understand something I just said, please feel free to ask me to repeat it in different words, because then if you're sitting there the rest of the time trying to process that thing, you're not gonna get any of the rest, all right? I know it's intimidating. A lot of you are not gonna go, hey, Jackie, what is that thing you just said? But I really don't mind, if that helps reassure you. So we're going to talk about, when we're saying this first section here is how does affirming or inclusive education save lives? Well, first, to be able to discuss that, we have to kind of step back and go, well, how does the opposite harm? Okay, so we're going to talk about how this inclusive education helps reduce the stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination cycle. We're going to look at this cycle and break it down. Maybe you've learned this in some of your courses, because this is the kind of stuff we teach sometimes in sociology and anthropology. Psychologists, I think, also deal with this subject matter. Some other folks. I don't know about historians, Keep picking on my colleague Jamie back there, because it's fun. So what are stereotypes? Again, it's more, what I'm about to put here, there's a lot more than this, but I'm simplifying it for the case of our talk here today. So what are stereotypes? I'm sure you all have a sense of stereotypes, what they are. You've either all had them in your head or other people have had them about a group that you're a part of. So it's a false belief about an entire group of people. So for example, if I say something like, all young people are lazy, that's a stereotype. It's a false belief, all right? That leads to prejudice. And sometimes people kind of use them interchangeably, but there is an important distinction here, right? Stereotypes are a belief. It's what you think you know. People who hold stereotypes in their heads, they're convinced that this is knowledge, not belief, right? They think they know this. All X are Y. All youth are lazy. All youth are addicted to their cell phones. All teachers are mean. All teachers are out to get us, right? Things like that. That'll lead to prejudice, right? Because then if you have a belief about a group of people, when you meet an individual who belongs to that group, you're going to prejudge them based on the belief you have about that group. So if I believe that all youth are lazy, if one of you comes and chats after and goes, oh, hey, Jackie, do you mind sending me your slides? I'll be, you're lazy. Right? I'll prejudge you. I don't even know you. Maybe I haven't even met you, but I'll assume you're lazy. I'll have a prejudice against you based on my stereotype that all young people are lazy. Okay? And then that leads to discrimination. You treat people differently based on your stereotypes and prejudice, right? And sometimes, when we're not in power and we have stereotypes, well, then it becomes hard to discriminate because we don't have the power to do it. But then when we're in positions of power, everything's relative, but relatively speaking, teachers have some amount of power compared to students, doctors, nurses, lawyers, judges, cops, politicians, right? They have a lot of power to discriminate, landlords, employers, right? So then we're getting into power differentials, right? So then if you are a person that has any kind of power over other people and you're acting, because that's what discrimination is, it's an action or a set of actions based on what you have in your head about a group and how you're judging a person, well, then you're going to treat people differently. So if I have a stereotype in my head that all students are lazy, and one of you comes to me and say, hey, if I give you my name, and so can you myo me your slides? And I'll be like, well, you're lazy, so no. Whereas Natalie asks me, I'll be, oh, yeah, sure, you're a teacher, you're not lazy, right? So, depending on the context, this can have life or death ramifications. Think about racial profiling. Cops who have stereotypes about, for example, black men, indigenous men, and then they'll see one on the street and prejudge them based on that stereotype, and then boom, arrest with no particular reason, sometimes resulting in violence. We know there are stats on this. Any of you ever heard of Joyce Echaquan? Joyce Echaquan, a few people. I'm glad that you've heard of her. This is very recent. So some nurses had a stereotype about indigenous women, that they were all drunks, that they were all on drugs. Joyce Echaquan, who was an Atikamekw woman suffering in a hospital and who they had given morphine to even though she was allergic and was having a reaction to that morphine. Because of their stereotype, they had a prejudice that she was just a drunk or she was on drugs, and that's why she was reacting like that. So instead of treating her with care like they might have if she had been a white woman, they let her die. So that's kind of the main cycle here. Stereotypes leading to prejudice, leading to discrimination. There's, more nuance than this, but for the sake of our talk here. But there's more, okay? So here you're gonna see an image of Jean-Paul Restoul, who's an Anishinaabe scholar, and he's presenting something, and I'm not playing the video, but there's a shot from the video with the drawing he has on a board. He's talking based on the work of this organization here, the Sioux Lookout Anti-Racism Committee, and he has this same thing, right? So he has it in the shape of a wheel, stereotypes, prejudice, leading to discrimination, and he completes this loop here with self-fulfilling prophecy on one hand and rationalization on the other. And this one I think is a little bit less concrete and a little bit relatable, but I'll just kind of try to flesh it out so that we can move forward and see how this all works. So you have this process we just described where a lot of people, sometimes people with power over other people, have stereotypes in their head and then meet individuals from those groups and have prejudice against those individuals, and therefore discriminate in ways that can be harmful. Well, then the results of that harm, sometimes poverty, high rates of addictions in some population, high rates of incarceration, high rates of domestic violence, a lot of things that come with poverty, for example, because when you're in these situations, there's a lot of mental health impacts that can lead to addictions. And again, these are all very complex topics that you can read about. But then if you're on the outside, you see these results and go, all these poor people, all these homeless people that are on drugs, well, it's their own fault that they're homeless. So then you have this rationalization in your head that it's okay to have stereotypes and prejudice against them and discriminate them. And the results of pre-existing discrimination is what can lead you to think that those stereotypes are valid. So it's like a wheel, right? You have false beliefs that lead to prejudice, that lead to discrimination, that lead to people thinking, they're not worth our time. And then it enhances the stereotypes. For the people involved, it can lead to a similar thing, but like, oh, yeah, look at all these stereotypes about my people who look like me, and the prejudice we face and the discrimination we face. We must not be worth a lot. So that self-hatred that people can have. All right, so basically, without these fancy words, how we can look at it is like this. This is just kind of a summary of what we just said in maybe more concrete terms. False information leads to stereotypes. Stereotypes leads to prejudice. So you have from belief to attitude, and then to action. So prejudice leads to discrimination. So action. The arrows aren't quite lined up. I can't do anything straight, apparently. I always have to stick that into a presentation somehow, right? Have to queerify it. Action leads to harm, so in the form of injustice and violence. When you discriminate against people in any kind of way, it causes harm. Either, some kind of violence, whether that's verbal violence, whether that's online harassment, that can have it's not benign, can have huge mental health impacts. Anybody who's been bullied in any way knows this. Right? And I'm sure a lot of you have been bullied. It's a sad state of affairs, right? Some kinds of injustice, some people getting hired or not hired simply on their last name, or whether they have an accent or the color of their skin. And it's never because of those things, it's because of people's perceptions of them, right? And then this whole process leads to people so what we see now, for example, if we see that among all the people who are poor and homeless, there's a disproportionate amount of, say, racialized people, LGBT people, and so forth, it's easy to think, well, it must be their own fault. There must be something wrong with them, right? That's what we mean when we say rationalization. You see the results of hundreds of years of discrimination, and it just emphasizes the ideas you might already have been taught about certain groups of people, or about yourself and your own family and community. So, long story short, what I'm getting at here is that stereotypes aren't just funny things that you can joke about, they lead to this cycle of severe harm against entire populations. So what does that have to do with our topic today? We'll see that shortly, is that this whole rationalization, like we were saying before, there's the self-fulfilling prophecy and so forth. It can be internal or external. It can be external. You dislike certain groups of people. So if you were raised in a family that was telling you that, oh, all those queers, all those trans people, they're freaky, they're groomers, they're this, they're that, they're yucky. Well, if you grow up thinking that, and you don't feel you identify with those things, you know you're straight, you know you're cisgender, for example, you're not trans, well, then you might just continue to see these people as gross and you're going to stay away from them. And when you're a student, you might participate in bullying, which harms people for life, by the way, right? It's not just an immediate hurt feelings things. There's studies that show that bullying, even one incident of bullying in your life can harm you for life. It can harm your self-concept, right? And later on, depending on your position in life, it can lead you to engage in hate crimes towards people. It can lead you to engage in different kinds of violence, even murder, right? So the classic case, this still goes on. You'll have some men who'll hire sex workers who are trans women who have not had any surgery, right? And they'll have sex and they're really excited by it. And then they feel so grossed out after, because of all these stereotypes that they have, that they wind up often murdering these women, right? So, very severe effects here. So these stereotypes are not benign. So when external rationalization can be towards a group that you're not a part of, or that you think you might be, but you're denying it and you don't want to be, right? It's complex. And then there's the internal, the hatred of self. And we'll look at a couple of stats soon and see, the suicide rates among 2S LGBTIQA people is horrible, all right? But even if they don't go to that extreme, there's all other ways that people can self-harm. So low self-worth, depression, anxiety, these rates are very high among any population that is marginalized because of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, okay? So this is all to, it's not to kind of be super negative, but just it's a reality. And when we talk about this legislation shortly and some of these movements, the Hands Off Our Kids movement and what they're trying to do, they don't always realize, some of them actually have what they think are good intentions, but they don't realize that they're perpetuating this, that their actions can lead to very damaging thing: violence, hate crimes, murder, self-harm, suicide, and so on and so forth. So real world, let's look at a few of these stats. This was just a really quick search, on some academic articles, and they're linked to, there's 2 pages there's a reference list, so those of you in methodology, we can't do full APA with a hanging indent in PowerPoint for some reason. It didn't work, but, you're supposed to do that. Yes, I've taught IP. All right, but the links are all there, and you can go look at them if you find them useful for a paper you're writing. So some real-world impacts. Here is hate crimes based on sexual orientation. So based on Statistics Canada, between 2022 and 2023, by the way, as we'll see, 2023 is when a lot of legislation went through that was trying to push back against inclusive schools. And these Hands Off Our Kids movement, that's when it started. Or at least maybe they'd been planning it for a long time, but that's when they took to the streets. So in that year, 69% increase of hate crimes based on sexual orientation. That's not benign, right? Remember, that's a form of discrimination. It comes from prejudice and from stereotypes. That stuff we were just talking about. From 2016 to 2023, here's the rise in these hate crimes. It went back down a little bit in 2024, but still, that's still pretty high compared to 2016. So sometimes, in the past couple of decades, a lot of us have felt, oh, compared to the 80s and stuff, things are getting a lot better, but this shit's still happening. All right, here in, specific to transgender and gender diverse people in Canada, 59% experienced violent victimization. They're 2 times more likely to experience unwanted sexual behavior, which can take a whole bunch of forms. More likely to experience online harassment. As we said before, this is not benign. Online harassment has driven some folks to suicide and other things. So these are, based on Government of Canada's website. suicide, and this is not, this is based on actual research by sociologists and such. More on transgender and gender diverse people in Canada. So in the year preceding, so this is all from a study that was done in 2018. And so when they did this study, they were looking at what had happened the year before, and they found that 14 to 18-year-old transgender folks had 5 times the risk of suicidal thoughts compared to non-transgender youth of the same age. Nearly 2/3 seriously considered suicide in the year leading up to the study. Then a little bit older, but still youth, 19 to 25, nearly 8 times the risk of serious suicidal thoughts, over 16 times the risk of a suicide attempt compared to non-transgender people their own age. That's too much. One person is too much. But look at these numbers, it's frightening. And these are, again, real-world impacts of that whole stereotype to prejudice to discrimination cycle. And when you see this, some people are tempted to say, well, there's just something wrong with them, right? So that whole rationalization. And in fact, online, it's horrible. There are some people, anti-trans people, who harass trans people, and they'll look at some stats. For a long time, there was the number 41 or 42 floating around about how worldwide 41 or 42% of transgender people took their lives. And they would write to trans people. They could find people who were very public about being trans and say, you're going to be one of the 41ers. You're going to be one of that 41%. Imagine being the target of that kind of, and it sometimes a lot of people hesitate to be open, right? So if you've seen some comics circulate online by Sophie Labelle, who's a trans artist, right? And she's awesome, and she gets, every day, she gets so much hate mail, and she's been doxxed with these kinds of things. So you're afraid to leave your home at some point, all right? So this is the authors of the study where this comes from. So if inclusive education that some of us have fought so hard over the past few decades to, reduce the stereotypes, increase the inclusiveness, if this is rolled back, if all the progress we've made is rolled back, kids who are trans, who go through this system, are going to continue to grow to hate themselves, often committing suicide as a result, or, dealing with depression, anxiety, self-harm, addictions, all the things that go with low self-concepts. And kids who are not trans will continue to grow up either in complete ignorance, so they think they don't encounter any trans people until they get into the adult world, and then it's like, ugh! Right? Or with hatred in some cases, possibly bullying trans folks as kids, and then later on, if they're working in healthcare, in the political system, in the legal system, in education, they might overtly discriminate because of how they were raised. Okay? So that's what we face if the people who want to push back and roll back inclusive education win. So clearly we can't let them win. So here's some, let's see what I'm doing on time. Okay, we're not going to get through them all, but shortly what we're going to go through is go through some of their talking points, how they justify their actions, and kind of look at how we can debunk that and look at some of the underlying stereotypes. Oh yeah, quick nuance. I said this quickly before, but sometimes we'll say something like somebody was killed because of their race, because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation, because of X, Y, Z. It's not their identity itself that caused, and I don't like that phrase, it's never because of who they are that they're killed. Polytechnique, every year, December 6th, the 1989, people say, they were killed because they were women. It's like, no, they weren't. They were killed because of sexism and misogyny, right? It's the hate that kills. They're harmed or murdered or commit suicide because of hatred by others or by themselves or both, because hatred by others can accentuate hatred of self, right? I think, again, this is something that we know instinctively if we've ever been bullied or discriminated against in some way. All right, so both self-hatred and discrimination can kill people. I know I'm such a buzzkill today, but here's why I say inclusive education can save lives, and there's no way to prove that, right? Because you can't say, oh, this many people are alive, and if they wouldn't have had this curriculum, they'd be dead now. We don't know. There's no way to prove that, right? But there are some studies that can show how much better students feel when they are in an inclusive environment. So what are some positive impacts of gender-affirming education? So one of the things we said earlier when we're talking about two prongs here when it comes to inclusive education, one is respect for people's names and pronouns and identities, right? So there have been studies that show that when a student, and this is all high school age for the most part, there are fewer symptoms of depression and suicide ideation when students who are trans or gender nonconforming and ask to be called by a different name and use a different pronoun, when they are respected, they're at lower risk of these things. And so respecting people's names and pronouns and identities is a protective factor in the safety of students, right? So it can go a long way towards preventing these low self-concepts, the self-harm, and so on and so forth, and it doesn't hurt anybody else, because when you say, it's okay to be you, it's great to be you, it doesn't mean that it's horrible to be someone else, all right? It's not oppressive to other people to affirm people's identities. And then we also talked about the other prong, which was curriculum. So inclusion of transgender and gender diverse identities in the curriculum play a role in these supportive environments, because then when all the students are exposed to positive exposure, seeing that there's nothing wrong with being lesbian or with being gay, with being two-spirit, with being transgender, with being intersex, they're less likely to become bullies and more likely to be accepting and to be able to make friends with people who are not like them, which is a life skill, right? So these are positive things. And again, like since we've been working here, we've seen how the work we've done with the Open Door Network, you know, from the time I started teaching here in 2022, more students in the past few years have felt free to be themselves, knowing that more teachers, more staff, more fellow students were supportive of them. And in the past couple of years, we've seen that actually decrease a little bit. More people are scared. The Open Door Network went a little dormant at some point just because it was all volunteer work and people burnt out, right? But I think that's something that needs to be revamped, and that kind of thing needs to happen, because yes, that actually touches on this with the stereotypes, right? There are people who are accepting, right, nominally, but they'll have these attitudes like, oh, but they're so angry, why can't they just ask nicely for us to use the correct name and pronoun? And sometimes you do explode. I have exploded, I'll be honest with you, 10 years after my transition here at work, when people had known me longer as Jacky than they had with my name assigned at birth, and as a he rather than a she, I was still getting people misnaming me and misgendering me. Even today, once in a while, it happens, all right? And then if I get mad, because, yeah, I was really patient, but then 10 years later, I'm like, dude, what the fuck? And then I'm the angry one. I was patient for 10 years, I blow my shit 10 years later, and I'm the angry one, and then they become afraid, similar to what you're describing. So stereotypes sometimes aren't necessarily to the extreme, oh, they're all bad and disgusting, but sometimes it can be that. And that paralysis that comes with fear of fucking up. When those of you who are just learning about these realities, or anything really, I'm just gonna snooze my alarm here. It's really listening to the person, and if you fuck up, as you will, as you're dealing with any kind of anti-oppression and becoming more aware of a reality that is not your own, you know, again, this can be along different lines. It's not just homophobia and transphobia, racism, all these kinds of things. You're learning, you're gonna fuck up. I fuck up as a white person, you know, but then you go, okay, sorry, thanks for teaching me something, and then I go and inform myself. So instead of being paralyzed, that's a good way to go, right? But yeah, it's not overnight. And yeah, here I don't want to paint a rosy portrait, because yeah, there are still some problems. We still, even a few years ago when we're like, oh, things are so great now compared to 20 years ago, but we still have work to do. But now we're kind of peddling to try to defend what we've already gained. Because there are people working against that. So it's quite simple. If stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination lead to harm, reducing stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination can help reduce the harm. So less hatred of other people, less hatred of self. So what's the current political and social context that I keep talking about? I'm going to kind of just give you an overview of some legislation and this Hands Off Our Kids movement, and hopefully have time to debunk one or two of their claims really quick, because we're almost at the end already. Well, we want to have time for questions. I'll try to leave like a good 15-minute for questions, and maybe some of those things will come up. So the wider North American concept, if you read the news at all, you listen to some of our politicians in the States, here in Canada, here in Quebec, there's this whole, oh, wokeism, those evil woke people. They're trying to censor us. They're trying to take away our rights. And like, you know, the whole Antifa thing. Anyway, so they're framing things like, you know, diversity, education, and inclusion as discrimination. So when you're, you know, they have a lot of misconceptions about what this means, by the way, right? We saw this in the States, and we're seeing it trickle up here, this kind of and if you don't know, like in work, this is educational institutions, different kinds of environments who try to remove barriers that certain people face to access employment and housing and healthcare, right? It's not about quotas, it's about saying, okay, for example, racialized folks, indigenous folks, queer folks, etc., have faced certain barriers to employment. How can we remove those barriers so that they can access things like everybody else, okay? Claims of cancel culture, claims of left-wing bias in education and media. You see this, you know, fear of threats to traditional family values, or traditional gender roles. These evil wokes are trying to erode the traditional family values. And this makes me laugh, because I'm an anthropologist, and we go into the deep past, hundreds of thousands of years ago. So when people say traditional families traditional family values, I'm like, how far back do you want to go? Because I can go back before there was any organized religions. Right? And the traditions were very different. It wasn't the heterosexual nuclear family that some people think are traditional. You know, half the time I'm taking is this clicker that for some reason is. Again, really quickly, how does that look like specifically, you know, in terms of gains of transgender rights that have happened over the decades? There's all this bathroom panic, men in dresses going into women's bathrooms. Like, come on, people, that doesn't happen. Drag queen panic. Drag queens are not necessarily trans, but that's all part of this big bundle of homophobia and transphobia. Oh my God, drag queens are, you know, men wearing dresses and reading fairy tales to kids. And it's not like they're doing strip teases or anything sexual. They're just reading goddamn fairy tales. But people panic about it. Rollback of gender-affirming care, especially for youth. So you have a lot of misconceptions that 6-year-olds are getting sex changes. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen, all right? And the surgeries that do happen to kids are on intersex babies because they're obsessed with making them clearly a girl or a boy, and they suffer for life because of that a lot of the time. So you want to talk about surgeries, talk about that. And you know what we're talking about today, this wider context, there's a lot of pushback against inclusive curriculum and pushback against that whole thing of teachers respecting the identities of trans students, okay? So what does that look like concretely? All right, so there's been provincial legislation, you know, as of 2023 that has actively laws designed to try to prevent some of this progress or push it back. So for example, in 2023 in New Brunswick, the government at the time modified Policy 713, which has to do with education. And it was reversed, by the way, because a new government came into power and there was a lot of pushback. So fortunately, this is no longer the case, but they did successfully do it for a little while, is that they made parental consent required for school staff to formally use the chosen names and pronouns of students over 16. Before that, it was under 16. So if you were under 16, you were at a school in New Brunswick, and you wanted your teachers to call you by a name and pronoun that was different than what was on record, they would need your parents' permission, which is pretty shitty, and that's still the case. But then they extended that in 2023 to over 16. That's no longer the case, all right? And we're going to see why they thought this was a good idea, right? Saskatchewan, same, very similar thing. They had an amendment in 2023, and that is still on the books. It wasn't repealed. So there was this, you know, an amendment to the Education Act, which governs a whole bunch of things about education, all right? And this was a clause respecting parental rights. So they're saying kind of the same thing as this. If a kid is trans and they out themselves at school and they want their identity to be respected, the parents need to agree. all right? Which doesn't sound malicious on the surface, but we can see that that's very harmful. If your parents are transphobic and you're trans and you're worried that they're gonna kick you out, and then you have your school betraying you by calling them and going, hey, guess what? Peter wants to be called Jane. And then who knows what your parents are going to do to you, depending on, you know, how they are, right? So these are very dangerous ramifications. And there's other places. Alberta wants to do something similar with healthcare now, and depending on who we wind up as government here in Quebec, we don't know what's going to happen. And like we said, this kind of helps push back against this move to reduce stereotypes, right? And it increases stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination. And doing that is discrimination. To say, you know, a lot of kids have nicknames that don't necessarily have to do with gender. So if Natalie says, hey, call me Nat, nobody's gonna say, no, you're 15, I gotta get your parents' permission to call you Nat, right? But if it has to do with gender, right? So, I don't know if I'm offending people. A lot of people are leaving. Sorry, not sorry, if that's the case. So there's also this social movement I keep mentioning. So this is an organization that's opposed to SOGI education. I'll hopefully have time to tell you a little bit more about them. SOGI stands for sexual orientation, gender identity. So this is an organization that provides materials that teachers can use to have a more inclusive curriculum. And so this movement is against that because they think it's being imposed, and it's not. It's available for teachers to use if they want, right? They're affiliated with a bigger organization called 1 Million March for Children, so they're claiming to protect children, claiming to support parental rights, again with this idea that parents have the right to know what their kids are being taught, which legit. But we'll see there's an assumption that it's hidden, which it's not. You can go on any province's Ministry of Education website and see the curriculum. It's all there. I even put a link to the Ontario one here, but it's an easy Google search, or browser search, I should say. And they're claiming to protect kids from something called gender ideology, which makes me laugh, because you know what? What else is a gender ideology? Patriarchy. And a lot of people don't object to that being taught in schools. So that protest I showed you before, that's what was going on. You had these folks marching, saying, hands off our kids, leave our kids alone, keep SOGI out of schools, okay? And I can show you some images, right? So they claim they're not against 2S, LGBTIQA people, but if you say that you don't hate me, but then you say, but I don't want my kids to learn about you, I'm like, You don't hate me, but you don't want your kids to learn about me. Therefore, I'm not fit to be in schools around your kids because you're afraid I'm dangerous. I don't know. I don't know what to follow that up with, but it doesn't seem to make much sense to me to say that you don't hate me, but you don't want me around your kids. Yes. Okay. Just 5 more minutes. Just go look at a couple of these claims. There are a lot, so clearly I'm not going to get through them all. I over-prepared because I'd rather have too much stuff than not enough and stand here twiddling my thumbs. But let's look at a couple of these claims, and even if we just get to one, to just debunk it, all right? So there's one that's come up a few times that we might as well just go with this one here. So one of the claims that legislators, some of these people in New Brunswick and Saskatchewan, and some of the people in these Hands Off Our Kids movement, one of the claims that they make is that inclusive education, and education that is affirming of diversity when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity, that good stuff, they claim that it attacks parental rights to know what their kids are learning. You know, like this, it's this covert thing. So, and you see this on some signs, right? So we saw signs like this: keep SOGI against sexual orientation, gender identity, related education out of schools. You cannot cry inclusion while excluding parents. So a lot of them, they have this assumption that curriculum on sexual education, sexual orientation, gender identity is covert and hidden, and that they send their kids to school and they have no idea what happens there. And then you have these big, mean teachers who are there cramming rainbow flags down their kids' throats. That's the image they have, and you see this on their signs. You can see a leather, and it's really, and it's unfounded, because here's the thing. What I keep mentioning here, SOGI. Sexual orientation and gender identity education. So this is an organization created in 2016. They provide materials that kindergarten to, level 12 or I think 13, whatever, K to 12 we often say, so elementary and high school, educators and school boards can use. But you know who legislates curriculum? Each province. So each province decides, and it's all online. Anybody can go. I did a quick search, and I found it's on another slide, so if ever you want these slides, I can send them to the teachers that are here, or you can ask me for them. You'll see a link to Ontario's page. You can find Quebec's page. Any province, you can find it online, and it's all there. So it's not a formal curriculum. So there's a link to SOGI's website. You see what they do. They provide different lesson plans that people can adapt and use depending on their context and the age group they're dealing with. Okay, so people panic about SOGI as if it was some kind of imposed curriculum that is secret and covert, but it's not. It's there, available for anybody to look at. So what they're assuming or ignoring or not acknowledging is that curriculum for all subjects is available, like I just said, on the province's education websites for anybody to look at. And a simple browser search, so there's a link here on this slide to Ontario's Human Development and Sexual Health Education curriculum by grade. And I don't know if it's the following slide, it's not this slide, but another slide I show, they don't even mention sexual orientation until grade 5, and they only mention it as one factor in a person's identity and how they relate to themselves. And then as the age increases, they'll talk about sexuality, obviously in an age-appropriate way, with regards to any kind of sexuality, all right? So that's just one of the many claims. There's this whole claim, too, really quickly, that we're groomers. You hear that term a lot, groomers. So all of us trans folks, all of us queer folks, we want to make all the kids queer and trans somehow, and just some of the stuff I have here is a lot of us grew up only seeing stories about straight people. Well, if we were queer, we didn't turn straight from reading those stories. So why was a kid who's straight become queer by reading stories about queer people? It's not logical, all right? So again, we don't have time to get through them all, but what I'll do is the teachers that are here, you can ask me, and anybody can myo me. I'll skip ahead to a slide with my name if you need the slides. If you want to look at some of the research, some of the links to get more information, you'll be able to do that. But basically what I go through and do in these slides is I have 6 of these claims that I elaborate on and debunk, okay? And the sources are all at the end, blah, blah, blah. Actually, I'm going to do it like this. It'll be quicker. I just want to show you so you know what to look for. So I go through all these claims, and there are links at every step. And at the very end here, my references. 2 slides full of references. APA style. Woohoo! Yeah, I don't like APA either, all right? But I want to close on this before we move to questions. I have a bunch of closing thoughts here. I guess this is one that I'll share, is that all forms of inclusive education are good for everybody, right? So this isn't catering to what they say sometimes, a public interest group. Because when you grow up in an atmosphere where you learn about the world and the different kinds of people that exist, it's good for you because you know what exists in the world. Right? And so this doesn't harm anybody, but it helps so many people because it reduces those stereotypes. Every single person on the planet, I firmly believe this, and this is something I've learned intensely from spending time in Indigenous communities because it is a part of the spiritual worldview. Every person has gifts to give to the world. And they are all important, okay? So every time you harm somebody in any kind of way, it reduces the opportunities that they have to develop those gifts and share them with the world. And we all miss out. We all miss out. We would have so many wonderful things. Maybe there's somebody who would have come up with, I don't know, a cure for diabetes or cancer, so all those things that we're still on a quest for. But maybe some of the brilliant minds that would have come up with that, or maybe there are works of art that none of us in the room will ever be exposed to or be inspired by because some of those brilliant artists were, either they're just surviving as shadows of themselves because of this kind of discrimination and they hate themselves, or they wind up getting murdered or killing themselves. We all miss out, all right? So I encourage you to think along those lines, instead of just saying this is about one small community. No, it's about everybody because we all miss out, okay? And I guess the last thing that I want to share with you as a closing thought, what can you do if you're like, okay, this is important to me, I want to do something. Not everybody has to go march in the streets. That's not accessible to everybody, all right? And sometimes it can be dangerous, to be honest. Be wary of people trying to convince you to hate people that aren't like you. Those influencers, the Andrew Tates of the world, and I don't know who's popular right now, who's spewing whatever transphobic, homophobic, misogynist crap. There are a lot of them, including some politicians. Here in Quebec, we have Mathieu Bock-Côté, and the leader of the PQ, and anyway, a bunch of people, these influencers, right? They have something to gain. This is called scapegoating. This is what they did with witches, the church that was running Europe, and previous centuries. They didn't want poor people to realize who was actually oppressing them. Instead, be afraid of your neighbor who might be a witch because she's a widow and she has a cat, right? Or the talk about immigration right now, right? Oh, the housing crisis is because of those evil immigrants, right? Just don't even get me started on that, right? So that's influencers. When they try to convince you to hate, they're drawing your attention towards a specific population. It's because they have something to gain for it. Be wary of false claims and assumptions. Again, the whole stuff about kids getting sex changes when they're 6 in their schools. Like that. Or schools with cat litter and like kids identifying as cats. Like, it's nonsense. Do the actual research and learn the facts instead of just believing all the memes. And get to know people who have different experiences and identities than your own, instead of being afraid of that student who uses they pronouns because you're afraid to fuck up. Just talk about the class, start having conversations about other things with them, and you'll see they're a human like you, and you can relate to a bunch of stuff, and you'll get more comfortable. And then the next time you meet somebody who uses they pronouns, maybe you won't be so scared, right? It's like that with anything. Don't be neutral. That's the last thing I want to say before we take some questions. Don't be neutral, all right? So you're just like, okay, yeah, this is a bad thing. This is harming people. Well, get informed more about it. And when people spew some nonsense, speak up, speak up. People close to you will listen to you more than they'll listen to somebody online, all right? So next time at family dinner, somebody's saying some nonsense. So, if you go through these slides on your own time, you'll see I debunk a bunch of claims and I provide some links. Feel free to use that. And if there's something you don't understand in those slides, once you have access to them, feel free to reach out and I'll gladly clarify anything that's in there. So I'll stop there so that we have a bit of time for questions. We have about, I think, less than that now, 5 minutes. Sorry, but there's so much to say.
I'm just curious, in like situations, let's say people open to you the door, right? And then after that they say, thank you, and they misgender you. Mm-hmm. How would you approach, or how should we approach in such situations?
So the person being misgendered, how would they approach being misgendered? Okay. Everybody's different, right? I would say that it's like with anything else. Some people, I've known some people, to be honest, like even some fellow trans people that I found sometimes would get upset very fast when it's a situation where maybe they're early in their transition and it doesn't really show, and somebody would use the wrong pronoun or something, or say lady or sir, and they'll get upset. Well, this person doesn't know you. I mean, but to me, it's a question of circumstance, right? So for me, if it's just a cashier, because I have an androgynous name, sometimes people from the government or something call me on the phone and they go, Madame Valle, because they think Jacky is a woman's name. And I don't care, because I'm like, well, it's not insulting to be thought of as a woman, whatever, and I'm never going to see this person again. If it's somebody that I know, that I work with, colleagues, students, people in my family who consistently do it for years and years, even after being gently corrected multiple times, then yeah, I'll be upset, right? My first tactic is to gently correct and hope that they learn faster, sooner rather than later. And then if they keep doing it, then I start to think, well, maybe they don't care enough to make the effort, in which case I don't want them to be a part of my life. Because why would you want somebody in your life who doesn't respect who you are, right? And that can be applied to anything. Some of you might choose, for example, to not have kids, and there's still a lot of stigma against people who choose to not have kids. So what do you do if you choose to not have kids and you have some family members who every time they see you, when are you gonna have a kid? Well, maybe you're gonna wanna cut them out of your life or only see them once a year. So similar thing to me as with anything else. So my strategy, again, just to reiterate, gentle correction if this is somebody I'm gonna see on a regular basis. If it's just somebody on the phone who I'll never see, honestly, I don't really care. Or I might mention it if it's a longer conversation so they avoid assuming this about other Jackies. It's really situational. But I tend to not get mad unless I see that it's persistent or malicious. And if you come up with questions later, you can Mayo me. So my email is there, Mayo. Teachers can ask me and send it. You can send it to your entire class if you're here with the class, but individual students can also write to me. And even though I'm on sabbatical, I'll keep checking for about a week. Thank you for coming.